Okay, so today we're going to be looking at bioengineering.
Yeah,
Um, and we're using this series called Bioengineering, Ethical Boundaries of Reshaping Life.
right.
And it's really interesting because, we're at this point now where we can engineer life and it's got so much potential to, solve problems,
Yeah,
whether it's medical breakthroughs with gene editing and lab-grown organs, or even,
right.
helping the environment with synthetic organisms that clean up pollution or
Hmm,
making drought-resistant crops.
that's amazing.
It's incredible. But,
Yeah.
it brings up this question, like, just because we can reshape life, does that mean we should?
That's the question, isn't it? That's what this source is really getting at, I think.
Right.
It wants us to think about the ethics of it all.
Yeah.
It's not just about listing the pros and cons. We need to go deeper.
Yeah.
Think about the unintended consequences.
Like Icarus flying too close to the sun.
Exactly. We can get so caught up in the excitement of what's possible that we forget about the potential downsides.
So where do we even begin with something as complex as bioengineering?
Well, the source rives into this whole playing gods argument.
Yeah, I was going to say.
But it does it in a really thoughtful way.
Okay.
It unpeaks why people get so uneasy about that phrase.
Right.
It's about the fear that we're messing with something we don't fully understand.
That makes sense. We're talking about the very building blocks of life here.
Exactly. And that leads to some even trickier questions about, what is engineered life? What's its moral status?
Okay, now we're getting into the really mind-bending stuff.
Right. Like imagine we create a synthetic organism or
Mhm.
even a hybrid of some sort.
Yeah.
Does it have intrinsic value?
Mm.
Do we owe it any ethical consideration?
I mean, it's forcing us to rethink what we even consider to be a person.
Absolutely. And then there's the whole issue of lab-grown brains.
Oh, wow.
If we can grow a brain in a lab, how do we define its life, its consciousness? Does it have rights?
Yeah, that really throws a wrench into our traditional views of personhood.
For sure. And the source doesn't shy away from getting philosophical about it either.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it touches on utilitarianism,
Okay.
which, weighs the benefits of bioengineering against the potential risk.
Right.
But what if those risks involve, like, irreversible damage to ecosystems?
Yeah, how do you even quantify that?
Exactly. So utilitarianism has its limits.
Okay, so what are some other philosophical angles that might help us make sense of all this?
Well, the source also talks about virtue ethics,
Okay.
which focuses more on character traits,
Oh, interesting.
like humility, caution, respect for nature.
I see.
So instead of just asking, can we do it, it's more about, should we do it?
Right, and if so, how should we approach it?
Exactly. And then there's deep ecology,
Okay.
which argues that all life has inherent value regardless of its usefulness to us.
That's a pretty different perspective.
It is. It challenges us to reconsider our relationship with nature.
It sounds like there's no easy answer here.
No, not at all. Each philosophical lens offers a different perspective, but none of them gives us a clear-cut solution.
Yeah.
And it gets even more complicated when you start talking about human enhancement.
Oh, yeah.
Imagine being able to not only cure diseases, but also enhance our abilities.
Like making us stronger, smarter, live longer.
Exactly. It's the ultimate slippery slope argument.
Where do you draw the line between therapy and enhancement?
Right, and the source brings in Michael Sandel's work here.
Oh, okay.
He argues that this type of enhancement commodifies human nature.
So if we could just buy better genes, what happens to the values of effort and hard work?
Exactly. And what about accepting our limitations?
It almost feels like it could create a society where some people are just genetically better than others.
And it raises questions about identity, too. If you edited your genes to be more athletic or intelligent, would you still be you?
Wow, that's a deep one. It makes you wonder if our genes even define who we are.
Right. How about the impact on relationships, careers, our sense of self-worth?
Yeah, I mean, would we always be chasing the next genetic upgrade?
It's something to think about, for sure.
Definitely. Okay, so we've got these big philosophical questions about playing God and the slippery slope of enhancement.
Right.
But what about the real-world risks?
So yeah, the practical concern.
Right.
And this is where things get even trickier because the source highlights some serious issues around justice and equity.
Okay.
Like, for starters, most of this cutting-edge bioengineering is incredibly expensive.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point.
So who actually gets access to these life-changing therapies or these enhanced crocs?
If it's only the wealthy, then it just widens the gap between the haves and have-nots.
Exactly. And then there's the whole issue of biopiracy.
Biopiracy.
Yeah, where companies exploit genetic resources from indigenous communities or developing nations
Oh, wow.
without their consent or offering fair compensation.
That's just wrong.
It raises all sorts of questions about consent ownership and the ethical distribution of benefits.
Yeah.
It's not just a scientific issue, it's a matter of social justice.
And what about the environmental risks? I mean, we're talking about introducing engineered organisms into ecosystems that have evolved over millions of years.
Absolutely. What happens if they outcompete native species or disrupt those delicate balances? It's like opening Pandora's box. We need to be prepared for the unexpected.
It sounds like we need some serious safeguards in place before we go any further down this road.
We do, and the source actually points to the 1975 Asilomar Conference as a historical example.
Oh, okay.
This was a gathering of scientists who recognized the potential dangers of recombinant DNA technology,
Okay.
which was an early form of genetic engineering, and they voluntarily agreed on guidelines for its safe and ethical development.
So they were being proactive.
They were, but the scope of bioengineering today is so much greater than it was back then.
Right.
We need updated, comprehensive, and globally coordinated regulations to keep pace.
And that's got to be tough, right? With different countries having different priorities and values.
You're telling me it's a huge challenge, but it's a challenge we have to face. The potential benefits are enormous, but we have to proceed with caution, wisdom, and a deep sense of responsibility.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've explored the potential of bioengineering and the ethical concerns it raises.
Right.
So where do we go from here? How do we navigate all this complexity?
Well, the source offers some guidance. It emphasizes the need for interdisciplinary dialogue.
So breaking out of our silos.
Exactly. We need scientists, ethicists, policymakers, and the public all working together.
That makes sense.
And we also need to prioritize what's called the heuristics of fear.
Heuristics of fear?
Yeah, it's a concept from Hans Jonas, this philosopher.
Okay.
He argued that when we're dealing with technologies that could fundamentally alter life, a healthy dose of fear can be a good thing.
Not like paralyzing fear, though, right?
Right. More like a realistic awareness of the potential for harm.
So we need to think about the worst-case scenarios, not to scare ourselves, but to guide our decisions.
Exactly. By acknowledging the possibility of harm, we can be more proactive about preventing it.
This source is really giving us a lot to think about.
It is. It's not just about the science. It's about equipping us with the tools to think critically and ethically about this powerful technology.
It's a lot to digest, but it's a good reminder that with great power comes great responsibility.
Absolutely.
And speaking of responsibility, I think it's time to shift gears and explore some real-world examples of how these ethical dilemmas are playing out right now.
I agree. Let's dive into some specific cases where bioengineering is pushing the boundaries and forcing us to grapple with these tough questions.
That's exactly what we'll be doing in the next part of this deep dive. We'll be exploring how these ethical considerations are shaping the development and application of bioengineering in fields like medicine, agriculture, and environmental science.
So stay tuned. We'll be right back with more on the fascinating and challenging world of bioengineering.
It's kind of crazy to think about how fast things are moving in the world of bioengineering.
Yeah, it's changing so rapidly.
I mean, stuff that was pure science fiction just a few years ago is becoming reality.
Absolutely. Like CRISPR-Cas9, for example.
Oh yeah, CRISPR.
When that emerged, it was a game changer.
It felt like we were stepping into uncharted territory.
We were this incredibly precise way to manipulate genes.
And all the talk about design your babies.
Right, all those ethical questions we're still wrestling with today.
Especially as the technology gets even more sophisticated.
And it's not just tweaking genes anymore.
No.
We're engineering entire organisms now.
That's right. The source talks about things like bacteria that can break down plastic.
Yeah, amazing stuff.
And crops that can thrive in droughts. I mean, this could revolutionize agriculture.
It could, and help us tackle climate change.
It's mind-blowing, but I keep coming back to that question of unintended consequences.
Yeah, that's a big one.
What happens if these engineered organisms escape into the wild?
Right, you can't just assume they'll play nice with the environment.
It's like we're messing with systems we don't fully understand.
Nature is incredibly complex.
And speaking of unintended consequences, the source also brings up the potential for bioweapons.
Oh yeah, the dark side of bioengineering.
If we can engineer organisms to do good, couldn't someone use that same knowledge to create something harmful?
Absolutely, it's the dual-use dilemma.
Right?
The same technology that could cure a disease could be used to create a deadly pathogen.
So how do we prevent that without stifling innovation?
It's a tough balance, but we need strong international cooperation and strict regulations.
Yeah, we can't let fear stop progress, but we also can't afford to be reckless.
It's about finding that middle ground.
But on a more positive note, the source does highlight some amazing breakthroughs that are already helping people.
Oh yeah, the medical applications are incredible.
Think about gene therapies that could cure genetic diseases that were once considered incurable,
It's amazing what they're doing.
or the possibility of growing organs in a lab.
Wow, yeah, imagine a world without organ donor waiting lists.
It's like science fiction, but it's happening now.
It is, and yet even these incredible advances raise ethical questions.
Like, what happens to human diversity if we eliminate all genetic diseases?
That's a good question. Diversity is crucial for resilience.
Right, both for the individual and for the species as a whole.
We need to think long-term about the implications of our actions.
And bioengineering is making a big impact in environmental science, too.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
I was fascinated by the discussion of synthetic organisms that can clean up oil spills or break down plastic waste.
It's like we're turning pollution into a resource.
It is pretty incredible.
It's a really innovative approach to some of our biggest environmental challenges.
But again, we need to be cautious.
Absolutely.
How do we make sure these engineered organisms don't backfire?
We can't just assume a solution that works in the lab will be safe and effective in a complex natural environment.
It seems like a recurring theme here is the need for rigorous testing and careful monitoring.
Definitely, and a lot of humility.
We're still learning so much about the complexities of life.
And we need to acknowledge that our interventions can have unforeseen consequences.
Which brings us back to the importance of ethical frameworks and regulations.
Right, we need those guidelines to ensure that bioengineering is used responsibly.
For the benefit of all.
Exactly.
But who gets to decide what's ethical in a field that's constantly changing?
That's a tough one. Is it scientists, governments, society as a whole?
And how do we make sure those decisions are made democratically and transparently?
That's a great question, and I don't think there are any easy answers.
Right.
I think it starts with open and honest conversations like the one we're having now.
I like that, involving the public, educating them about the potential and the risks.
Exactly. Bioengineering is going to shape our future, so everyone should have a say in how that unfolds.
And it shouldn't be decided behind closed doors by a select few.
No, it needs to be a public conversation.
We need to cultivate a culture of scientific literacy and ethical awareness.
So that everyone can participate in these crucial decisions.
Because ultimately, we're all stakeholders in the future of life on this planet.
We are. And speaking of stakeholders, I think it's important to bring in a group that's often overlooked in these discussions.
Oh, yeah, who's that?
Indigenous communities.
That's a good point.
They have such a deep understanding of the interconnectedness of life.
Right, and the importance of respecting nature's balance.
Their perspectives are essential.
Absolutely. And the source raises the issue of biopiracy.
Right, where companies exploit their genetic resources without consent or compensation.
That's a clear injustice.
It is, and it needs to be addressed.
We need to make sure that indigenous communities are full partners in any bioengineering endeavor that affects them.
Absolutely. Their lands, their resources, their traditional knowledge.
It's about respecting their rights and their cultural heritage.
And we can also learn a lot from indigenous knowledge.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
They have such a long tradition of understanding medicinal plants and sustainable agriculture.
It's a wealth of knowledge that we can integrate with modern science.
To create more holistic and ethically informed approaches to bioengineering.
It's about recognizing that we're all interconnected.
That our actions have ripon effects throughout the web of life.
And that's a powerful message to carry with us as we continue to explore the frontiers of bioengineering.
It is. It's a reminder that we're not just manipulating genes and cells, we're shaping the future of life itself.
And that future is full of both incredible possibilities and daunting challenges.
But by having these open and honest conversations,
by learning from each other,
and by prioritizing ethical considerations,
we can create a future where bioengineering benefits all of humanity and the planet we share.
Exactly. It's up to us to shape that future.
It's interesting, as we talk about all this,
Yeah.
it makes me think about the stories we tell.
Oh, about bioengineering.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, it's not just about the science itself.
It's about how we think about it, how we frame it.
Right.
The narratives we create.
And how much of that is influenced by science fiction.
Oh, absolutely.
All those classic
Okay.
stories.
Yeah.
Frankenstein.
Right. Gattaca, Jurassic Park.
We've been grappling with these ideas for centuries.
Through stories.
Yeah, like they're warnings almost.
Yeah. Cautionary tales.
About messing with nature.
Playing God.
Right. But they also make us wonder,
Yeah.
what if?
They spark our imagination.
Exactly.
It's funny how many of them focus on those unintended consequences.
Right.
Like we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
We can't always predict how things will play out.
And it's not just about the science, it's about what it means to be human.
Exactly.
In this world where we can engineer life.
Yeah, it's shaping our identity, our values.
And those stories, those narratives, they have power.
Oh, they absolutely do.
They influence how people think about bioengineering.
Yeah.
And that affects policy decisions, research funding, everything.
It shapes the whole conversation.
So how do we make sure we're telling the right stories?
Good question. I think it starts with recognizing the power of those stories.
Okay.
And then making sure we're not just talking amongst ourselves.
In the scientific community.
Yeah, we need to bring in other voices.
Okay.
Ethicists, philosophers, artists, writers.
So it's not just about the science.
No, it's about the human impact.
The big questions. We
Exactly.
need more than just data and lab reports.
Right. We need to engage with the human side of things.
I love that.
Find ways to connect with people on an emotional level.
Use art and storytelling.
Exactly. Make these issues come alive.
So it's not just an intellectual exercise.
No, it's about feeling it, understanding the implications.
And what about young people?
Oh, that's so important.
They're the ones who are going to inherit this world.
They are, and they often have the most insightful questions.
Fresh perspective.
They
again.
challenge us to think differently.
We need to make sure they're part of the conversation.
Absolutely.
Give them the tools to understand bioengineering.
And the ethical implications.
So they can form their own opinion.
Informed opinions, yeah.
And we can't forget that bioengineering is a global issue.
It is. It's happening all over the world.
So we need to make sure everyone has a seat at the table.
Different cultures, different perspectives.
Because what's ethical in one place might not be in another.
Exactly. We need to be open to different ways of thinking.
And really listen to each other.
Yeah, it's about finding common ground.
Even when we disagree.
Right.
So bioengineering,
Mm-hmm.
it's full of possibility.
It really is.
But it comes with a huge responsibility.
To use this technology wisely.
To think about the consequences.
And to make sure it benefits everyone.
It's a challenge.
It is.
But it's one we have to face together.
Absolutely. This isn't something any one person or group can solve on their own.
It's up to all of us to shape this future.
That's right.
Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive.
It has.
So much to think about.
A lot to consider.
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for listening to everything, and remember,
Bioengineering is powerful.
but it's up to us to use that power responsibly.